Otterburn is a charming village located in the northern part of Northumberland, a region renowned for its breathtaking natural scenery and picturesque landscapes. While the village was smaller in the 1930s, it had an active social scene with weekly dances held at the Memorial Hall on Saturdays, as well as other social gatherings throughout the week. The community fostered a close-knit atmosphere. Unfortunately, the peaceful atmosphere of the village was shattered one night when it found itself at the heart of a perplexing mystery. A member of their close-knit community fell victim to a seemingly heinous crime. Joseph Foster, who owned and managed Foster's Garage, worked alongside his eldest son and other mechanics in the family-run business. The garage not only served as a place for car repairs, but also encompassed various other operations. Evelyn, at 28 years old, had been running her own hire car service for some time. On Tuesday, the 6th of January 1931, work had been slow for Evelyn, but as the evening approached and the cold started to bite, she found herself being called for. 3 customers waited, along with some parcel drop-offs. Wrapping up against the cold outside, she headed off. When Evelyn arrived, the 3 passengers got in, and the parcels for the drop-off were placed inside. The witnesses on the journey that night recalled what happened and what they saw while travelling with Evelyn. Her first stop was at Horsley, 3 miles north of Otterburn, when one of the packages was dropped off. The front seat passenger, Mr. Glendinning, gave the package, which I believe was fire bricks for an open fire, to Hedley Anderson, the blacksmith of Horsley. Mr. Glendinning asked the blacksmith if he'd seen his sons, as they were due to collect some calves he had bought. The blacksmith, Mr. Anderson, replied that they hadn't, but he saw some lights in the distance, so he thought that would be them on their way. Now, while they had this conversation, Mr. Glendinning thought he saw some headlights from a car in the forecourt of a nearby local pub, the Reddersdale Arms. The other passengers, Mrs. Murray, who was seated in the back, was sure she had seen headlights passing them, but the other passenger, also sitting in the back, Robert Wilson, hadn't noticed any headlights, but recalled seeing a man, Douglas Nelson, who was delivering newspapers, cycling south towards Ellishaw Road. The next stop was a place called Stobbsgate, where Mr. Glendinning got out to walk the rest of the way up to his farm. On the journey towards Rochester, a car passed, shining its full headlights on Evelyn. She slowed down. Later, when asked by the police, the passengers recalled not being able to see the driver of the passing car. At Rochester, Evelyn's next stop was to drop off some bags of straw, leaving them with a couple of men who had come to collect them. The next stop was Robert Wilson's. He got out and started his walk to his farm. He recalled looking back and seeing the lights of Evelyn's car in the distance, and some minutes later he saw the car returning towards Otterburn. Mary Murray, the last passenger, got out at Birdhope Craig Farm. When she returned home at 7 p.m, she told her mother she was going straight out again, as she had another fare, who she had collected from Ellishaw Junction, and wanted to go to Ponteland to catch a bus. She explained to her mother that while driving home, she had been hailed down by some occupants of a car standing at the side of the road at Ellishaw Junction. A man approached and told her he was heading for Newcastle but had missed the last bus. Someone had apparently told him he could get a Newcastle bus at Otterburn. The passengers of the car had taken him as far as they could, but were going to Hexham, so they dropped him at the junction. Why is not known, as Otterburn is a short distance from the junction, and they could have turned into Hexham Road from there. But they may not have been local, and possibly didn't know that. Evelyn apparently explained to the man that the last bus for Newcastle had gone, and the only place he could get one at that time would be in Ponteland, and she would drive him there if he wanted. As it was a 40-mile round trip for her, she informed him the fare would be around £2, which was a good amount back in the 30s. But it may be less once it had been properly worked out. Once in Otterburn, the man decided to go to the pub to see if someone could give him a lift into Ponteland, but arranged with Evelyn that if he couldn't get a lift, he would wait outside the hotel for her near the bridge. Her worried mother asked Evelyn who this man was. She replied he seemed like a respectable, decent man, well-dressed and well-spoken. Her father worked out the fare for £1.16, and it was passed on to Evelyn. After filling the car up with petrol, it was suggested that she take a chaperone with her, as her parents were worried. After picking up her mother's flashlight, she departed, but for some reason she decided not to take the chaperone, George Phillipson, with her. After the expected time they had calculated for Evelyn's return, they began to worry. Maybe Evelyn's car had broken down or possibly been involved in an accident. As the last bus that went on the same route was due in, Joseph Foster thought if something had happened, they would have seen it, and it was about 10:30 p.m. When the last bus pulled in, the driver jumped out and ran straight to Gordon Foster, telling him Evelyn's car had been burnt out and Evie was burnt too. Gordon, Tommy Vassy and both the bus driver and conductor ran to the bus, where a badly burnt Evelyn was sitting on a chair covered by the coat of the driver, Cecil Johnson. Gordon asked her who had done this. Evelyn replied, "That awful man's done it. Gordon, bring us a drink." At 10:45 a call was made to the local policeman, Constable Andrew Ferguson. It was Joseph Foster calling regarding his daughter. Joseph told him what had happened to Evelyn, and the attack is described as follows. Evelyn had picked up the man at 6:30, brought him to the village before taking him south. About 6 miles south of Ollerton and 3 miles north of Kirk Welpington, he pulled her out of her driving seat and hit her over the head, then threw something over her. He then started to drive the car. The car took fire while they were in it. Just then another car came up, picked the man up and took him off, but cannot say in what direction. Things became a little more chaotic as more people joined to see what was happening. Tommy Vassy stayed with Evelyn while her mother made a bed for her daughter. Gordon fetched a drink, and Evelyn's two sisters, Dorothy and Margaret, looked on helplessly. Mrs. Foster shouted instructions for the doctor to be called, and the neighbour, Adeline Jennings, came to help. Joseph rushed to his daughter, asking her who had done this, but she couldn't answer. Gordon then picked his sister up in his arms and carried her into the house. With Tommy Vassy's help, they took her upstairs. Evelyn managed to tell them that the man had thrown something over her, and she and the car went up in flames. Meanwhile, outside, Cecil Johnston and Tommy Rutherford were telling how they had come across Evelyn. They left Newcastle at 9 p.m. and reached Ponteland at 9:20. On their journey home, they reached Wolf's Nick, where they saw something burning. As they got closer, the two men got off the bus and saw a car still smouldering. They couldn't see anyone around until they started looking further, and then they saw a figure on the ground. Cecil Johnson, when kneeling down, realised it was Evelyn. She opened her eyes and said, "Oh, that awful man." The two men wrapped her in a coat and carried her to the bus. Mrs. Foster hurried to care for her daughter. She bought more fluids and tried to make her comfortable. Although her face was severely burnt, it wasn't until she managed to remove Evelyn's clothes that she saw the terrible extent of her burns. Evelyn's whole body was covered in burns. Her skin blistered and charred, her eyes puffed and dark, her face swollen and blue. Eventually the district nurse and doctor arrived, and they treated the burns as best they could, applying creams and ointments to help with the pain before bandaging the wounds. Later, Dr. McEachran spoke to Joseph and Margaret and quietly told them Evelyn's injuries were too severe and the likelihood of her surviving was not good. When Constable Ferguson reached the Fosters, he was unable to see Evelyn because she was being cared for by her family. It wasn't long before the Constable Superior arrived, Sergeant Shanks. The house was now buzzing with people. 2 doctors, a nurse and family rushed around trying their best to help. The police were desperate to get a description of the attacker from Evelyn, but for now all they could do was ask questions of the men. Apparently Mrs. Foster had attempted to get some answers from Evelyn, but the doctor had told her not to bother her too much for now. And it's now, it would seem, that the police came under fire for not getting the information straight away. Once Dr. McEachran came down the stairs, the police went straight up to see Evelyn, with the doctor's words echoing in their head that Evelyn wasn't expected to live. When the policeman finally managed to talk to Evelyn, the room was full. Mrs. Foster sat next to her daughter's bed while they asked questions. Evelyn's answers were understandably low. This in turn caused Mrs. Foster to put her ear to her daughter's mouth and listen, then pass on the information to the police, but they did manage to hear some of it. Constable Ferguson and Shanks then left after about 20 minutes, hoping to talk to her the next day. In the early hours, Dr. McEachran administered a substantial dose of morphine as Evelyn lost consciousness. He then left her in the care of the nurse, knowing that Evelyn was not going to regain consciousness from this state. This was once again a cause for contention, as it led to the police being unable to obtain more information, as the good doctor had failed to inform them of this. Because of the confusion after Evelyn's death, they had to rely on all those who were present at the time to give their separate statements. Mrs. Foster was at the forefront of the statements. As clear as she could remember, she gave the police as much information as she could, starting with what Evelyn had said about the man. Mrs. Foster told them the man had gotten out of the car to hail her down. She said she didn't know how many people were in the car or what they looked like, but thought there must have been at least 2, including the attacker. The nurse added that she heard Evelyn say she heard the man thanking the people in the car, and from all accounts that night they believed one was a woman. It was also agreed that Evelyn had heard the man saying he was hoping to get a bus to Newcastle, but had missed his bus. When Evelyn was asked to describe the man, she said he was respectable looking, wearing a dark coloured overcoat, black or blue. He wore a bowler hat and had dark hair. He was clean shaven and between 5'6" and 5'8" in height. She said he didn't speak with a Scottish accent or Tyneside accent. He was well spoken, possibly with a North Country accent. She spoke of returning home when the man got out and went to the inn. She briefly went into the house, then back out to the car. She drove down the village where she saw the man waiting for her. She drove south, getting as far as Belsay. The man sat in the front. He wasn't drunk but had a smell of drink, which she smelt when he got closer to her. While she drove on, the 2 chattered about cars and driving. It was said by witnesses that the man had mentioned he didn't know the area, but he knew the Midlands. According to Evelyn, when they reached Belsay, the man asked to drive the car and also wanted to turn back. His demeanour had changed when she questioned why. He told her it had nothing to do with her. There was apparently some back and forth between the 2 about the bus he wanted to catch. He demanded to drive, but Evelyn wasn't having that. so he apparently moved closer to her and took the wheel. It was said at the inquest that Evelyn had been struck in the face, making her eye sore. It was while he drove that he said he had a car of his own and was going to get it. At this time of answering her mother's questions, Evelyn had told her that it wasn't possible to call for help as there wasn't anyone around. Evelyn was apparently squashed up against the driver's car door as he had forced her over when taking the wheel. The man drove to the top of a hill called Wolf's Nick and pulled up. Why stop? According to Evelyn, he offered her a cigarette, of which she refused. He spoke to her, mentioning that she was an independent woman, and strangely started to pinch her arms. This then carried on to an attack when he apparently hit her, knocking her to the back seat. Due to the information being collected from those who had been around Evelyn while she lay in her bed, some of the information became confusing as some of the answers were heard differently. And the statements had to be pieced together by the police. If the police had been allowed to talk with Evelyn at the time, this would have been done professionally and the right questions would have been asked. One of the women by the bed heard Evelyn say that she thought she'd get out of the car when he hit her again and bundled her into the back seat. When Mrs. Foster asked her daughter if the man had interfered with her, Evelyn answered, "Yes, mother." This horrified her mother, and Evelyn replied, "Oh, mother, I could not help it. I fought for my life." When the police were eventually allowed to see Evelyn, her mother was adamant she stayed. The police were not prepared to argue with her. Sergeant Shanks had asked Mrs. Foster to question her more about the term interfere, as the answer to this was vague. They needed more. But it was plain to him what she meant. Evelyn then gave a statement on what happened next. The man took something out of his pocket and threw some kind of liquid over her. He set her alight. How the car became inflamed she didn't know. All she could recall was the car moving and bumping over rough ground. She managed to get out of the car and quickly shook her coat off and then attempted to put out the rest of the flames on her clothes, all the while choking on the fumes. She remembered laying on the ground near the car and needing to drink to quench her thirst. She thought she heard a car stop and then leave. She tried to pull herself closer to the road, but no help was offered. She lay there for some time before Johnston and Rutherford found her. PC Ferguson was given instructions that after interviewing Evelyn, he was to go to Wolf's Nick as soon as possible and to take as many officers as he could with him. Sergeant Shanks reported directly to his superior, Superintendent Thomas Shell, who alerted the surrounding constabulary, Northumberland Police Headquarters, and other forces further afield. Motorcycle police were sent out to cover main roads and inquire at all the garages. Officers were sent to investigate at Ponteland. After Shanks and Ferguson had got as much information from Evelyn as they could, they headed up to Wolf's Nick, with Gordon Foster driving and a couple of Foster's employees. At Wolf's Nick they inspected the burnt-out car. As forensics was still in its early stages back then, in 1931, some mistakes were naturally made, but the police noted some of them and tried to correct the situation as best they could. Those that were not police were instructed not to touch anything and to leave everything as it was. PC Proud, who had joined them from another area, spotted a can on the shelf of the car. It was a petrol can. PC Ferguson found a bottle that smelt of lime juice. Remembering that Evelyn had said the man had thrown liquid from a bottle over her, he collected it. Other items were collected, including a burnt purse with some cash still in it. PC Proud noted that both of the offside doors of the car were open and both the near side doors were closed. The two men who first came across the scene, Cecil Johnston and Rutherford, remembered both the offside doors being open, but when they returned later with the police, someone, they said, had opened the front near side door. But it is possible that the doors could have been opened by one of those that didn't know the procedures. An unsecured crime scene was open to mistakes. Before an officer from Ridsdale could secure the scene, a reporter managed to get there and had no qualms about looking around the area and disturbing the scene. Jack Jerome picked up Evelyn's scarf, handed it to his driver to look at, and it was placed over the headlights of the burnt-out car. His disturbance of the scene could have hurt the inquiry immensely. Inspector Edward Russell was called between 3 and 4 a.m, and as he was based in Purdue, it would take him some time to get to the crime scene. On his way, he requested PC William Turnbull to get to the scene and secure it. Turnbull travelled on his motorbike, arriving at 6:30 a.m, and secured the scene. Inspector Russell arrived at the Fosters' home at 6 a.m. to interview Evelyn, but when he arrived he was told by the family that Evelyn was unconscious and they were waiting for the doctor. Russell informed Superintendent Shell at Hexham. Russell then walked over to the Redesdale Arms to make inquiries. On his way he spoke to a man, Alfred Anderson, who had been outside the previous evening around 6 p.m. He told of a car pulling up and asking for directions to an inn. Anderson described the man as having a Northumbrian accent and the car had a Tyneside number plate. Anderson went on to add that he told the man there was an inn about a mile onwards. The man thanked him and drove off. Anderson also noted that there were 2 other men inside the car. The landlord, Benjamin Pryor, also remembered the men. They had ordered whisky for each of them. He said they didn't converse much, but seemed in good spirits. Pryor went on to add that he had asked the driver if he knew the 2 men he was with, as he didn't like the look of them, then suggested the driver be careful when the driver told him he had picked them up along the road. Those that were in the Riddlesdale Arms that evening gave a description of the men, and the timing was around the time Evelyn would have been passing the parked car with the man hailing her down. More information was gathered over time from the inn. Russell then went to Foster's garage to hear the news that Evelyn had passed away and never regained consciousness. Russell's inquiries would be made more difficult as those he needed to question had all gone about their work and were not available straight away. Chief Constable Captain Fullerton James, who was on his way to retirement, took control of the case and Russell had to report to him directly. Acting on some information from the inn, Russell went to question a Cuthbert Stappard. He was an unfortunate young man who had been given work by the local rector of Elsdon. When questioned after being found walking along a road near Rochester, he told the inspector that he'd been working as a gardener for the rector. It was confirmed by the said rector and his alibi was solid. Unfortunately, 6 months later, he would be found hanging from a tree. In the meantime, while Russell was driving from place to place, Sergeant Shanks had interviewed all of Evelyn's passengers that night. The 2 PCs, Turnbull, who had been relieved by another officer at the crime scene, and Ferguson took statements from people in Otterburn. Another officer was at the station taking calls. This was tough going for those in this case, as it would become clear there weren't enough resources for that area. They were struggling and they needed more officers. Back then, all the information had to be typed out. Sometimes up to 3 copies had to be done. The paperwork that was done for this case was vast from day one. Inspector Russell and the small number of officers who worked on the case would soldier on, despite the constant hampering from the more senior officer. The local coroner, Dr. Philip Dodds, was contacted and informed the police that he would commence the inquest on Thursday, January the 8th. Dr. McEachran then relayed to the coroner that Evelyn's body was severely burned, making it impossible to determine the cause of death. As a result, a pathology specialist was requested to assist with the investigation. A specialist in cars was also assigned to the case, and Mr. William Jennings was taken to Wolf's Nick to see where the car had left the road, then taken to Foster's garage to view what remained of the car. By now the phones rang endlessly, with people offering sightings of strangers and even offers of help. The media wanted exclusives from the police, and in the end the police decided to ask them for help. On the 7th of January, the police made an appeal to the public through a press release, asking for any person who may have been on that road between the hours of 7:30 to 10 p.m. to please communicate with them at Hexham. They also asked if the party that were travelling south from Scotland in a motor car, and from which a man whom they gave a lift alighted at Ellishaw End, north of Otterburn, about 6:30 p.m, if they would kindly communicate with the police at Hexham. There was also a news release on the BBC. It went: at 10:30 p.m. yesterday, a young woman named Foster, driver of a hackney car, was found badly burned near her car, just off the highway 6 miles south of Otterburn in Northumberland, in a very injured condition, and she has since died. Police are anxious to trace a 4-seater closed saloon, dark-coloured car registered TN, followed by 4 figures with the last or next to last number 2. The car left the Redesdale Arms near Otterburn at 7 p.m. with 3 men of the following description: 1. Approximately 38 years, 5'8", short dark moustache, very bad teeth, dark hair thin at the front, dark overcoat with broad belt, thin blue striped collar, smartly dressed, Scottish accent. 2. 40 years, 5'5", broad face, prominent cheekbones, very bad teeth, practically none in top jaw, slaty coloured suit, blue striped collar, Scottish accent. Number 3, 30 years, 5'7", clean shaven, well built, blue overcoat, no hat, Scottish accent. The men told the manager they were going to London. Any information concerning the car or the men should communicate to the Chief Constable at Northumberland. Although this broadcast was a big deal for its time, and it would reach all the areas that would possibly have never heard of the small area where the crime had happened, the actual car and the description of the men they wanted to speak to didn't have much to do with Evelyn's statement, as she had told of a man who she picked up after he held her down at Ellishaw after he was dropped off. Not to mention, this car hadn't stopped at the Redesdale Arms and was not going to London. At the end of the day, on the 7th of January, an exhausted Inspector Russell's first police report could have caused some controversy from someone connected to the Northumberland police, who had started to question whether Evelyn had actually been attacked. Russell's report read that he'd arrived at Wolf's Nick at 3:30 p.m. to observe the burnt-out car and the scene. He described the tyre tracks that showed the car had swerved from the west to the east of the main road. It had then gone down a steep embankment about 4'6" deep, and at an angle of 45 degrees. It continued down at about 90 feet from the road. It hit a marshy ditch where it veered left for another 108 feet across rough ground. He noted that the rear of the car was completely burnt out. The front wasn't badly damaged. Standing on the metal shelf at the back, which was practically all that was left, was a 2-gallon Shell petrol can standing upright. He found this odd, as it hadn't been in that position when PC Proud had been there in the early hours. The neck of the can was found close by, and the cap near to that. Looking under the car, he noted that the heather was scorched and burnt, but the tracks down were not, so he concluded that the car was set alight where it was found. He noted blood-like marks near the handle on the driver's side, on the near side mud guards, and some on the grass, which was dug up for evidence. He collected some items of burnt clothing that belonged to Evelyn, then arranged for the car to be taken to Foster's garage. William Jennings was asked to examine the site. He was an owner of a car showroom and a garage. He wasn't a professional by any means, but back then forensics were minimal. In his view, he found that the car had travelled around 10 miles per hour, as the stones that the wheels hit could have been dislodged if it had hit at greater speed, and the car could have overturned after hitting the stones if it had been going faster. He surmised that the steering wheel had possibly locked to the right, and where the tracks merged again, the steering had righted itself. After hitting the ditch, the steering locked to the left, and the car moved in a semicircular motion before coming to a halt in a dry gutter. He decided that although the car had seemed to lose control on its way down, it had been under some control, but after hitting the first ditch, the driver lost interest. Don't know what that means. Surely not. He then went to the Foster's garage to examine the car. He concluded the engine was switched on and in a low gear. He dismissed the idea that no one had been driving, which is apparently possible as the ground over the water ditch to the last ditch was fairly level, the first ditch slowing the vehicle down and the last stopping it. Jennings then agreed that the car was set alight where it was found. He also concluded, after checking the car throughout, that the petrol that leaked from the tank after the petrol cap has melted added to the fire's rage. The fire, he said, had originated in the rear passenger area and was done deliberately. Roxburghshire Police reported that officers in Jedburgh were unable to verify some of Evelyn's claims, as they couldn't find any witnesses who saw a man asking for a lift to Newcastle or taking tea. As Evelyn had said, he had told her he had taken tea with the couple who dropped him off, and no witnesses saw a man asking for a lift south. Nobody seemed to be able to corroborate Evelyn's story. Things were becoming murky in this case. People were either remembering things wrong or were glamorising the whole terrible affair. Once the news had spread via the media, possible witnesses came forward, and the police did their job by interviewing everyone. Many of those who were reported as suspicious-looking men wearing bowler hats turned out to be salesmen. After reading the newspaper on the 8th of January about what had happened, Alistair Bull immediately contacted the police, as it was he who, while driving from Scotland to London on the 6th of January, had picked up 2 men who were walking south along a road, and he offered them a lift. He had stopped at the Redesdale Arms and bought a round of drinks before dropping the 2 young men in Newcastle, gave them a shilling each, and went on his way. The 2 young men also came forward and told how they were trying to find work but couldn't help the police any further. This would be the case with others who had come forward after the news was released. When a Mr. Beattie came forward, he told the police that he'd been going home after buying a car at Darlington and had stopped for tea at Castle Eden at around 6:30. On his journey from there, he reached Wolf's Nick at around 9:50 p.m. and saw smoke and flames coming from the moor. As he got closer, he slowed down to see it was a car. He guessed it had been alight for some time, as he couldn't see anyone around. He thought they must have gone for help. He drove on thinking he might see them on the road, but he saw no one. On January the 9th, two men, Mr. Beach and Mr. Oliver, made a statement to Sergeant Armstrong. They were travelling workers who, on the 6th of January, were walking into Otterburn at around 6:45 p.m. to get some supplies, when a Morris Cowley car sped past them. Oliver thought he remembered a car parked just up from the Ellishaw junction. Beach thought he could recall the car speeding past, and after they took a short cut over a field, they saw another car going along the main road to Otterburn. The two men reached Otterburn about 7:30 p.m, where a motorbike passed, and they saw a man walking in the opposite direction, who had something light smeared on his boots. This would turn out to be a local labourer who also saw two cars on his journey, but the timing of the two cars he saw was later, and it was about an hour later. A couple of cars were seen on that road that evening, and witnesses came forward giving their statements to the police. Some said the cars they saw could have been Evelyn, but the bright headlights made it hard for them to tell. All local witnesses were questioned, even those who lived way out on their farms. The small force were thankfully helped by officers from Newcastle. By January the 10th, some newspapers were sharing doubt about Evelyn's story and the fact that the police had found no proof to corroborate what had happened to Evelyn. Their attention was turned to Captain James, who it had been claimed had his own doubts and theories about Evelyn's attack, of which he had made public, leaving some of his officers exasperated. The main problem for the police was lack of witnesses to what had actually happened to Evelyn. Another radio appeal was requested by Superintendent Shell for the public to help locate another car, the one at Ellishaw, where Evelyn had claimed she first saw the man who needed to get to Newcastle. And on the 10th of January, the BBC broadcast the appeal. That same day, Mrs. Bessie MacDonald came forward. She told the officer of Belsey, PC Francis Douglas, that she'd been visiting a neighbour on the evening of January the 6th, and at around 8:30 p.m. she walked home. As she got to her house, she saw a car coming in the direction of Otterburn. She saw it was a grey saloon with shiny door handles. After it passed her, she heard a screech, and glancing back, she saw the car had pulled up. As she had entered her home, she heard the car driving back towards Otterburn. This corroborated some of Evelyn's story, but apart from this, they had nothing. The extensive searching, questioning and statement taking took its toll on the undermanned force, stretching them to their limits, but they stuck with it, working long hours with more and more reports coming in about strange men on trains and mystery men lurking in places people thought they should not be. Captain James's theory was that it was possibly an obsessed lover, so PC John Eckford was sent to retrieve any letters and papers that belonged to Evelyn from her grieving family. But after Inspector Russell had read them all, he decided they were of no help. It didn't help Evelyn's case when the barman on duty that night at the Percy Arms insisted there had not been any strangers in the bar that night and nobody came in asking for a lift. Two employees of Foster's did see Evelyn Hudson at around 7:20 p.m. Bus driver John Robson pulled up to drop off some papers. His conductor, Oswald Young, got out. While Robson waited, he saw a car approaching. It was Evelyn's Hudson, but he couldn't make out if anyone else was in the car. When Young returned, he mentioned the car, but Young wasn't able to see it properly. On the 12th of January, PC John Eckford interviewed a man called William Kersop Reed, a well-respected man who was on his way to becoming a magistrate. He was in his 40s and he farmed at Old Farm, a mile and a half southwest of Otterburn. It would turn out that he was the owner of the car Evelyn had said she'd seen in her statement, and she had recognised. His statement to both Eckford and Shell read that on the 6th of January he had driven from Gosford to Old Town, setting off at 6:45 p.m. The drive usually took him about an hour and 10 minutes to get home. He remembered seeing a saloon car driving south. When approaching Bradford Banks, which is a couple of miles north of Belsey, he saw a stationary car facing north with its headlights switched off. Driving on while following another car, he remembered a saloon car passing and going south. The car in front of him turned off, but it wasn't traced. Apart from a truck and a bus, he was adamant he saw no other cars. He was positive in his statement that he knew Evelyn's car, and he knew he had not seen it. Sidney Henderson, a shepherd, came forward. His statement shows that, while walking home, he saw a fire in the distance near Wolf's Nick. He said he first spotted it about 8:45 p.m. By the time he reached home, the fire wasn't as bright. The investigation progressed by thoroughly examining and questioning every individual mentioned in conversation with the police. This exhaustive process involved conducting multiple interviews, in some cases even re-interviewing certain individuals. From those who were present with Evelyn prior to her untimely passing, to those who voluntarily came forward, as well as those who were implicated by others. The investigation required significant dedication and countless hours of hard work. PC Eckford and Sergeant Armstrong were sent to interview the proprietor of the Royal Hotel in Jedburgh on the 16th of January. This was following the statement Evelyn had made about the man had told her in the car where his previous lift had stopped for them to take tea. John Mackenzie, who called the police, and waitress Helen Wood remembered 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman, coming one afternoon around 12:30. They had had drinks and then a meal. Apparently they weren't the most pleasant of people. They gave very clear descriptions of the trio. One of the males was tall and broad. He had dark hair with a slightly red colour to his face. The other man had fair hair and was rather pale looking. The woman was plump and wore a fawn suit. The 2 men wore dark overcoats and bowler hats, and they all seemed to have a Midlands accent. It sounded promising, but apparently there were discrepancies with what they knew from Evelyn. If the man had taken tea, as he had said, it would have been later in the day, making it possible he had missed the Newcastle bus. But if they had had lunch, as described by the proprietor, the man would have had plenty of time to get the bus to Newcastle. The case became more frustrating. Confusion was constantly being thrown into the mix by newspapers, most of which stuck with the story Evelyn had made up the attack. The chief constable had also stuck to his beliefs that she had concocted the story to either cover that she had started the fire herself or an irate lover had attacked her. He would also lean very heavily on William Kersop Reed's statement that he knew Evelyn's car and he hadn't seen it. The captain also relied on William Jennings's investigation of the car, saying it had been driven onto the moor purposely as the lack of burnt heather on the grass, he claimed, meant the car wasn't set alight before on the road as Evelyn had claimed, but after it drove onto the moor. Those officers under the Chief Constable were growing more frustrated with their superior, and PC John Eckford put forward a letter to the captain, pointing out that the Newcastle CID had concluded that Evelyn had been murdered. If it had been a local, they would know the area and would have picked a better place to carry out the assault. He also pointed out that Evelyn had been asked repeatedly if she knew the man. She had replied no each time. The PC also added that the Chief Constable had no evidence to state his theory. None. All those that were present with Evelyn heard what they heard, and there was no evidence or contradiction from others to prove otherwise. In short, there was no evidence to say Evelyn was lying and no evidence to say she wasn't. The Chief Constable, while almost dismissing the frustration of his officers, carefully selected specific statements for the coroner. These statements were intended to draw the coroner's attention to certain aspects of the evidence that contradicted Evelyn's story. In a polite letter to the Chief Constable, the coroner, Philip Dodds, after having seen some of the media reports, had to ask for certain statements from John Kennedy and Albert Beach, whose statements he thought relevant to the case. Although the coroner was entitled to see any statements he needed, the Chief Constable told him the next day that those statements were not relevant. Dodds, it would seem, fought back, and the statements were put forward, so Kennedy and Beach gave evidence at the inquest. Professor MacDonald, who carried out the post-mortem, had been handed the remnants of Evelyn's burnt clothing. He then passed them on to Professor Dunn, who specialised in chemical analysis. The only item of clothing Evelyn's mother didn't have was her coat that she wore that night, as she wasn't wearing it when she came home after the fire. A small burnt piece of the coat was discovered along with her scarf at the scene. Dunn and his associates couldn't give a conclusive finding, only that the clothing smelt of petroleum and possibly paraffin. The coroner's report was released on January the 21st. It has been alleged that Mr. MacDonald, the coroner, visited the scene to observe and may have become more involved than intended by paying close attention to what the senior police officer had shared with him. The expectation was that his report would remain completely neutral and only focus on factual evidence. The pathology report stated that Evelyn had passed away due to shock after suffering extensive burns. That any signs of injuries caused by an attack, such as scratches and superficial injuries, were difficult to determine due to the severe burns. He did note that there was some blue discoloration on the root of her nose and on an eyelid, but after dissection there was nothing to say it was bruising. Supporting Evelyn's claims, MacDonald suggested that the distribution of the burns suggested Evelyn had been sitting for at least part of the time when she was on fire, and that the small round patches of burning on her upper body were consistent with something flammable splashing on her clothing. However, MacDonald didn't find any signs that Evelyn had been inappropriately touched, as there were no signs of lacerations or inner damage to a lower area under examination. But it wasn't until later, on the 26th of January, that he gave the second part of his report, which gave the explicit details of why he stated his reasoning that he could find no evidence of violation. This was a major blow to those who believed Evelyn's story, but the investigation must go on because no matter what, something had happened, but by who was the question. The inquest continued on the 2nd of February 1931 in the Memorial Hall. Before the court proceedings began, Dodds took a moment to caution the jury about Evelyn Foster's statement. Dodds emphasised that the statement, as relayed by her mother, should not be regarded as an absolute fact. Instead, it was the jury's responsibility to carefully evaluate the evidence that would be presented to them in order to determine its veracity. The first witness was Evelyn's mother, Mrs. Margaret Foster. She endured a lengthy grilling that lasted an hour and 40 minutes. She was then questioned by the solicitor for the police, Mr. Smirk, who apparently tried to discredit Mrs. Foster's statements to the police, as some of her wording didn't match what she had originally claimed Evelyn had said. Apparently, Smirk would go on to try and discredit other members of the Foster family. But Evelyn's story had been heard by at least 6 people, and that was a fact. When Mrs. Foster was asked if Evelyn had understood her when she asked if the man had interfered with her, she answered positively, yes. Was there any doubt about that? She replied, no. It had been up to the police to try and determine what Evelyn may have thought interfere meant, as back in the 30s young women were taught not to let a man touch you and to keep pure until marriage. So interfere could have meant a number of forms of unwanted advances, but Mrs. Foster knew what she meant, and she was adamant her daughter understood. But the facts from the medical records proved otherwise, and Mrs. Foster had just proved her daughter had lied. As the inquest went on, it would seem that some witnesses were not called, as their statements had been withheld by the Chief Constable. And it would also seem that because of those statements being withheld, the course of the inquest went towards the likelihood that Evelyn had caused the fire herself. It was especially noticeable when the coroner summed up the case to the jury, where he mentioned that it wasn't likely that a stranger would carry a tin or a bottle of petrol around with them. And he added, why hadn't Evelyn taken a known male companion with her, as her mother had suggested? And there was no evidence to show Evelyn had travelled to Belsey that night. Although there were 5 witnesses, only one of them saw a car. Although Evelyn had claimed the man had thrown some liquid over her, only traces of petrol could be found on her clothes. If the car had been alight on the road, why would the man drive off the road with the risk of injuring himself? He went on. There was no direct evidence the burns had been caused by a third person. It would be improper to bring in a verdict of that description unless they were satisfied beyond doubt as to how they were caused. After 2 hours and 10 minutes, the jury returned with the verdict that it was willful murder caused by some persons unknown. When a surprised Dodds asked if they had found that some individual had willfully poured petrol over her and set her on fire, the foreman replied, yes, we do. The waiting reporters, who were also surprised by the verdict, stood outside the memorial hall, and the chief constable came out. He told them the verdict went against the evidence and that he was satisfied that neither the car nor the assailant existed. It was said that the villagers were not going to see a well-liked young woman and popular family name be seen to be a liar. Others mentioned that if the jury had been made up of people from other parts of the country, the verdict would not have been murder. By February the 9th, the Foster family, working closely with friends, began their own inquiries and called in their own investigators and experts. Joseph Foster was quoted in the newspapers as saying he would do anything in his power to bring the murderer to justice. Unfortunately, they would find themselves being led a merry dance with far-fetched stories coming to light. One theory that caused an uproar was about Mrs. Charlotte Clark of Trough-End Hall. Apparently, before Evelyn's death, the Clark family and Foster family had had a dispute over some business transaction. After this, the Clarks stopped using the Foster's garage and used another in Otterburn. It all started with people's theories that if a car had been seen moving fast at Ellishore Bridge, but no car at around the same time was seen by Wallace and Bell when they travelled between Woodburn and Rochester, must mean that the car pulled into a local property. It was rumoured Alfred Johnston, who worked for the Clarks, had been fired by the Clarks after he claimed Mrs. Clark had been out in her car the night Evelyn was killed. The Fosters requested that the police investigate further regarding the story. Once the police examined Alfred Johnston's case and determined that the account of his dismissal was untrue, they proceeded to interview Mrs. Clark and her household. It was established that no one had actually used the car on that particular night. However, despite the police's intervention and inquiry, this rumour persisted for an extended period of time. Rumours seemed to abound over the years, and the police did as much as they could. Mrs. Foster had turned to clairvoyance and passed on all the information they gave her to the police. Shell later described that after so many hoaxes had been played on the Fosters and the police, that only reports that he deemed credible would be investigated. Many names were brought to the attention of the police and thoroughly investigated. One name that stood out was Robert Irving, suggested by the Cumberland and Westmoreland police as a potential suspect. The Northumberland police delved into his background and discovered that in September 1930 he had already been convicted of fraud. Additionally, Irving had a tendency to hire taxis without being able to afford them, and there was also some minor offences attributed to him. But violence wasn't one of them, and his description didn't really match. 3 years after Evelyn's death, another car was found burning with a body inside. Northumberland police couldn't find any link with Evelyn's case, but it was worth looking into. Ernest Brown was involved in an affair with a married woman, and it was her husband, Frederick Morton, who was discovered in the car. He had been shot in the head before the car had been set on fire in what seems to be an unsuccessful attempt to destroy the evidence. This crime took place in Yorkshire. It was a potential lead, but also full of discrepancies. He wasn't violent to women, and he wasn't one for travelling to Northumberland, and he had no reason to be travelling through Otterburn in January 1931. It was rumoured that Brown tried to speak at his hanging, and the words came out as Orktoburn or Otterburn, but there is no actual confirmation of this. Recently, an author discovered a potential suspect through thorough examination of all the files related to the case, specifically focusing on the inquest report. In January 1932, a patient in hospital heard of the arrest of a man called Alexander Kirkpatrick. The patient remarked to one of the nurses that he had always believed he was responsible for the Evelyn Foster case. The nurse passed on this information to the doctor, who informed the police. The patient, George Maxwell, a former police officer himself but now worked in agriculture, spoke to the police. He informed the officer that he'd been working on Lockhill Farm at Ringford, near Kirkcudbright. The dairyman there had been a man called James Kirkpatrick. And about a week after Evelyn's murder, James's brother Alexander, who was on a month's leave from the army and based at Berwick-upon-Tweed, came to stay with his brother. It was said he was very much a ladies' man and in the habit of dressing up in dark suit, overcoat and bowler hat. He was often heard boasting about his female conquests. Alexander's leave had begun a few days before Evelyn's attack. Apparently, he had told his brother and Maxwell he had enjoyed a week of scamming lifts from people travelling all over. After that, he spent some time with his mother in Dumfriesshire before arriving at his brother James's place. When the newspapers started printing the story of the events in Otterburn, Alexander was heard to say, "It was what a few more of them needed." Alexander Kirkpatrick was arrested when he tried to force himself on a 6-year-old girl. Superintendent Cunningham of Berwick-upon-Tweed was instructed by the Chief Constable to contact Kirkpatrick's regiment. The regiment gave Lance Corporal Kirkpatrick a glowing report, calling him an exemplary soldier, well liked among the men there, and had never been any cause for complaint. As far as the charges now against him, he had never shown any signs of this behaviour. Basically, they would never have thought that of him. He was sentenced to 4 years for the attack on the little girl, and in the process of this, it was discovered he had attacked another 6-year-old when he was 15 in 1919, which he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Each of these attacks were committed each time he was on leave. So in January 1931, he was on leave. At the age of 27, he stood 5'8.5" tall, dressed like a gent, flagged down cars for lifts, enjoyed impressing women with his knowledge of cars, and had shown little respect for Evelyn, in fact suggesting she deserved it. Chief Superintendent Fullerton James set in motion an investigation into Kirkpatrick's movements in January 1931. Dumfriesshire police asked his mother, but she couldn't remember if he'd spent the entirety of his leave with her, but she thought he'd stayed with his brother Andrew for a while. Andrew Kirkpatrick wasn't much help either, claiming he couldn't remember the dates his brother stayed with him. It would seem the police confused the brothers, as James and Andrew worked at different farms and they had mistakenly questioned the wrong brother. Alexander Kirkpatrick could have been the man they were looking for all along, and Chief Constable James might have finally thought that Evelyn Foster was telling the truth all along. So why did the questioning stop? Why didn't they pursue it further? In my book, Alexander Kirkpatrick is a viable suspect. What occurred in the car that night remains known only through Evelyn's statement. Regardless of the specifics, it resulted in a devastating loss for the family. During their darkest hours, they were subjected to countless reporters invading their privacy, incessant interrogations about their daughter's character, intrusive camera flashes, and uncomfortable onlookers at her funeral. The family's hopes of finding resolution were shattered. Thank you for watching.